a background with a background in building international coalitions, advising policymakers, and preserving human rights and democracy in countries like Nepal, South Africa, India, the UK, Sri Lanka, and the US. My biggest passion is social movements. Everywhere I've lived and worked has a legacy of social change spurred by people on the ground, activists refusing to budge, journalists confronting hard truths, and everyday people insisting on nothing less than the right to vote and live their lives in peace. But too often, the idea of social movements is relegated to the past and assigned to the actions of a few individuals, when in fact, collective change is happening right now through people fighting daily on the grassroots level to influence their communities to move beyond caste discrimination, gender-based violence, religious nationalism, and ethnic conflict, just to name a few. My goal for the conversation today is to unpack this within the context of my home region, because the history of South Asia is a history of social movements. I really want to know, how do these extraordinary acts of collective advocacy begin? What triggers a public consciousness to move beyond their safe and silent corners and help their neighbors? What makes a temporary movement a permanent revolution? To answer these important questions, I am honored to introduce the panelists for our conversation. First, Dr. Salim Rashid, a Bangladeshi American professor emeritus of economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His most persistent research has been concerned with the impact of religion on economic development, more specifically, the impact of Christianity on the economic development of Europe. Development economics has motivated many of the questions he has studied, such as land tenure, land reform, and microfinance. Professor Rashid has long been a critic, if not an opponent, of the belief that economics is a science. Next, we have Dr. Dovan Rai from Nepal. Dovan is the executive director at Body and Data, a nonprofit organization that works on digital rights and feminist internet. She has a PhD in computer science with research in the intersection of educational psychology, game design, and AI. She has led youth education initiatives and contributes writings on socio-political issues in Nepal. Next is Faria Aziz from Pakistan. Faria is a journalist and co-founder of Bolubhi, a digital rights and civil liberties advocacy group based in Pakistan. Her work focuses on freedom of expression and privacy, monitoring the implementation of the cybercrime law, especially the persecution of journalists and dissidents. She has appeared before various parliamentary committees, has been appointed as an amicus curiae, friend of the court, and filed various public interest litigation on digital rights issues. She regularly conducts digital safety trainings. We also have Wima Ranasinghe from Sri Lanka. Wima is an educator and peace-building facilitator currently serving at Eastern Mennonite University. Affiliated with initiatives of Change International, she specializes in facilitating programs on personal transformation, restorative justice, gender advocacy, and nonviolent communication. Finally, Dr. Rajmohan Gandhi from India. Rajmohanji is an Indian-born historian and biographer who was a member of the upper house of the Indian Parliament from 1990 to 1992, and subsequently a professor in the United States, where he currently lives. You all have such rich and diverse backgrounds and are each fighting for a better world in such distinct ways. For the audience, I'm really excited that you all are here. I invite you all to ask your own questions in the chat, and I'll try to integrate them in the conversation as we proceed. So, to begin our discussion, I'd like to start by asking a very simple yet foundational question. How does the fight for a better world start? How do movements start? Dr. Salim Rashid, maybe you can kick us off.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm honored to be here as part of this panel. I have a feeling that I'm neither fish nor fowl in this August group, because most of my work has been intellectually motivated. Excuse the frog in my throat. The basic issue that I have been most concerned with has been the impact of poverty on people's lives. And unlike several people who engage directly with the poor. My philosophy has been that if you give a man a fish, he will eat for a day. If you give him a net, he will eat for his whole life. I don't quite know who said it, but I think those are very wise words. And I've always tried to look for systemic changes in people's lives that will at least mitigate the evils of poverty. This being said, I should also point out that as a Bangladeshi American, I am somewhat astounded at the enormous social change that has just taken place in Bangladesh, utterly inexplicable by any of the tools of social science, when students, subsequently joined by the populace, succeeded in overthrowing a well-established autocrat who had all the weapons of the modern surveillance systems and arms and ammunitions at her beck and call. To say that I understand this would be false, and I am hoping that I will be enlightened about some of the things that have happened in this discussion. But what is not so obvious is that economic deprivation triggered the mass nature of the movement. So I don't feel completely out of place, and I look forward to hearing more discussion over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. I really resonate with that. I think a lot of what I also hear is how movements and revolutions start in the hearts and minds of the people. Dovan, I'm curious what you think about this with your experience of, the initiatives that you're a part of in Nepal.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. I'm really glad to be here. And for me, the idea of movement has always been very energizing for me. It always fills me with so much like this warm and fuzzy feeling. Somehow I felt very safe in this idea of movement. So I think for me, if I talk about myself, I mean, besides the cause, right? I think that's just the idea of movement, the idea of collective people coming together. It always, had a very romantic notion in me. So for me, I think I took part in some of the movements like the anti-monarchy movement when I was a student, and then the Madhesh movement against the this marginalization of the Madhesi community in the southern part of Nepal, and recently in the citizens movement in Nepal. And for me, it's like as Salim ji mentioned, I mean, economic crisis is one of the major, trigger of the movement. And because when people have the crisis, right, they start to think, what is causing it? They start to talk to each other, they start to read, they start to introspect. And also like when they feel that, I think for me, like when there's some kind of this collective narrative that is holding society together, right? And you believe in that, you subscribe to that. And when you feel that that is no longer serving, when you see that this narrative has some kind of like some holes in it, and then people start to they feel destabilized, right, among themselves. And I think at the time they want to create this new narrative, and I think they reach out to each other because, and maybe they feel, very positive, they feel something like bigger than in themselves, like maybe they have some new revelations, right? Okay, this is what is going on, and maybe they have this kind of urge to share. I think the way, we try to share these cute videos on the social media, when you feel that you have found something beautiful that's worthy of sharing, you want to reach out to that. And when you also see that, because it's not the individual thing, right, it's the collective narrative, collective vision that you want to enact, you want to reach out to each other. So okay, so for me, like always, this movement had a very like a positive notion in me. But recently, we have seen movements of different kind of taking place, right, which has also been happening in the world. So movement do not always come from the place of hope. Sometimes it comes from the place of like fear, right? People go out not out of hope, out of fear. It does always come out from love. It also comes out from anger. And so now I have a more mixed feeling in terms of movement, right? I mean, people are motivated, they are animated by so many different emotions, right? I think the challenge of the world today is how do we channel the hopeful, that sentiment, like this collective vision, rather than more like a nihilistic, that self-preservation instincts. Yeah, that has been my observation so far.
You bring up such an interesting point about kind of how movements change, and I want to come back to that. But I also want to quickly carry it over to Wima because we talked about the Bangladesh protests a little bit earlier with Salim, and Sylvan, a lot of the points that you're bringing up seem to resonate with what happened in Sri Lanka very recently. So Wima, could you add a little bit of context there? How did the movement in Sri Lanka begin, and how does that relate to what's been said already?
Thank you, Faisal, and I feel really grateful to be part of this panel. Yeah, talking about the movements, and I feel we have a violence history of people's movement in Sri Lanka. 1971 and 1989 and 1983, like all these violent revolutions had led country to a very destructive mode. But talking about the Aragalaya to 2022, the people's struggle, and being part of it, and I feel that moment actually arises with the systemic injustices when it become really unbearable. The economic hardships people face, the 13-hour-long power cuts, fuel queues, even the basic needs were not being met, and parents struggling to feed their children, and all that. And I felt there comes a point, that tipping point, when people feel compelled to act, and that shared by a realization change is not only necessary, but is possible. And it's small acts of people coming together and standing and showing play cards, and still like small acts. We saw like some local areas, people just gathering and organizing walks and protests, and then finally coming to a place in Colombo and occupying a place for nearly 90 days, and really asking for change in the political sphere. And I feel that moment of collective awakening is the spark for action. And that's what I see, how do movement starts. But at the same time, I just want to add this. In that time, I've seen how activists and politicians and all those people who work for social justice, they go into this mode of compassionate fatigue and burnouts, and that's why it's very important that when we are fighting for a better world, it begins with our own personal healings, and that's something that I personally believe in. And by addressing our innermost wounds and growing us as individuals, we cultivate that healthier relationship that really extend to heal our communities as collective. And it's a transformative journey. And even with all these political changes, I think all individuals have that individual responsibility to go through that healing journey. That's what I want to
Love, I think you said compassionate fatigue. I think that is such a great way to put it. I think about this question of burnout quite a bit. And Faria, I'm actually going to take this next question over to you, because every time I message you, Faria, I feel like you're always involved in something or another in terms of fighting back against the courts or some legal dispute or something. And you are one of the most resilient people that I know. I'm curious, kind of building off of Wima's point, how do you build a collective resilience? How do you prevent that kind of fatigue that happens when you're fighting against systems that are so embedded in injustice or prevent you from actually speaking out?
Thanks, Faisal, and it's an honor to be part of such an illustrious panel. it's resilience is a funny word because the city that I come from, Karachi, and it's been known for political violence and all kinds of things. And often we tend to pat ourselves on the back for being so resilient that despite everything, we go on with our daily lives. But the other thing what was just brought up is, and we also wonder now, though, looking at, other countries in the region, what is it that doesn't bring people to the tipping point in Pakistan, so to speak? There's all of that. We've seen Bangladesh, we've seen Sri Lanka, and there's all of that, the economic conditions, all of the other issues, but it doesn't culminate into something of that sort. And we've also discussed this South Asian sort of dysfunction, a lot of all of us when we get together. What is it that we resort to dark humor and self-deprecation to basically cope as a mechanism of whatever is going on? Because the space that I'm situated in is digital rights, but again, digital rights is connected to your larger political rights. And grassroots movements are now using that because they are completely, there's complete censorship of them from the so-called mainstream press, as we seem to call it, or mainstream discourse. And there's plenty happening. I mean, not to sound morbid, but these are realities, right? Where in Balochistan, in every household, there's a disappeared person, or they find mutilated bodies. And there's organizing around that. And these are people who've channelized their pain and suffering into something that's collective. Or in the northern region, which, the impact they felt post the war on terror years, whether it's, again, disappearances, landmines, regrouping of terror groups, and also that impact, and they're still grouping. And then they face that backlash from the state, where they are called either separatists or their terror groups are discredited. And we're divided along ethnic and political lines and all of these things. And we wonder, what is it? I mean, the economic conditions aren't great either. What is it that doesn't just bring people together? And unfortunately, we've seen things play out that it seems as if the otherization is so strong that, and the discrediting by sort of this hegemonic centrist narrative is so strong that they're always sort of the so-called periphery. And we don't like using the word periphery, but that really is what they're relegated to, and all of these issues, and there are these justifications carved out. But coming back to so the space that I'm in the digital rights space, and this year especially, as you know, earlier when I started out, and back 2010, 2012, when the discourse around social media, it was written off as this elitist, who's even on it? YouTube ban, 3 years, Pakistan suffered a YouTube ban. Who cares? It's just an entertainment medium. Today, though, everybody realizes how important internet connectivity is, because that's the only way you're able to communicate, to get your message across. But now the state has in its hand a switch on and switch off button, where sometimes connectivity will stop, sometimes now through different kinds of technology, they're going to throttle your access. So some things will work, some things will not work. There's no official acknowledgement. And then there's this whole plausible deniability was actually some fault or technical glitch. We're not doing anything. So it's kind of like authoritarian tendencies, which there are, but you also don't want to own up to it. And that puts you in a very difficult position. Just now, as you mentioned, this crisis to crisis. So it's not just a digital rights sphere. Right now, we've seen the 26th Amendment is something that it's complete capture by the executive of the judiciary. Not that the judiciary was really delivering to the people, but still, the high courts were a venue for filing petitions against, habeas corpus for missing persons recovery, right? Or a host of other digital rights issues. And while there's critique there, but the manner in which this was done, where you have midnight passage over the weekend, 4 a.m. enacting of the law, as if this is perfectly fine, and now this is the new status quo. And this facade, and now everybody going along with it. And it feels like there's a complete stranglehold. And they use this law as a way. And the question for us was, why aren't more people connecting to it? And again, in terms of silos, what relevance does the Supreme Court or Parliament have to the ordinary lives of people anymore? Which is why, even when you were advocating on this issue or trying to point out why this is going to impact people, and it will, there wasn't that connection. And I think what's happened over a period of time is that the entrenchment and the micromanagement and control levels, and also the divisions within society along political, ethnic, and all of those lines, I think has prevented everybody from collectivizing on something that you might consider as a one-point agenda that affects everybody, right? Like, for example, what our colleagues and friends have been saying in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka is the economic. It's not as Pakistan doesn't have an economic situation or inflation. We're on a World Bank loan, and there are a lot of other things that are happening. But it's just that the divisions have become so deep-seated that it's unfortunate that the collectivizing. So it's just firefighting. There hasn't been any sort of nothing that we can collectivize. It's one issue to the other because that's how they keep moving, and it doesn't resolve itself.
There's a theme here that you pointed out that I want to come back to about collectivism, but also beyond borders. And this is kind of the work that we've done on the side as well. But something you point out that I want to take to Raj Mohanji in just a second here is this kind of deeper entrenchment of divisions over time. Now, what I'm thinking a lot about is something Dovan brought up too, and I think it relates to everything you said, Fari, is how has collectivism changed over time? Raj Mohanji, I kind of want to bring this over to you. What have you noticed in your long history of human rights advocacy that, protesting, advocacy work, just how we frame collective change, how is it different then as opposed to now?
Thank you, Faisal. First of all, allow me to mark a very simple reality, which is that just now we have 5 wonderful flavors of South Asia coming together, which doesn't happen so often. The Bangladeshi flavor, Nepali flavor, Pakistani flavor, Sri Lankan flavor, the Indian flavor have all come together. So I want to record this moment of sheer joy that we are together. Now, on your question of how today people are coming together, in India, there is a significant current, fresh social movement, which asks people of different castes and tribes and religions to get to know one another, to listen to one another, to read about one another. This movement has been called the Bharat Jodo movement, or the Knit India Together movement. It asks us to give up the old habit of walking past our neighbors and not noticing them. Now, it's an obvious reality that large numbers of South Asians live today in the US, in Canada, Australia, Europe, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, places like that. And in these places, we from different parts of South Asia can easily meet one another. Usually, however, we do not meet. We're all busy people. So I hope that today's wonderful conversation, where so many from so many different parts of South Asia are actually meeting, that this conversation will be repeated in many places. Now, as an old man, my dreaming has very few restraints. So I dream of South Asians deepening their ties with one another, and also deepening their friendships with other communities where we live. Now, some of us South Asians who live in the Western world can involve ourselves in the history, the music, the literature, the art of other wonderful races, other wonderful communities with whom we share this sick planet, but still an amazing planet. And I'll just make one other point. By now, South Asian families have lived in Europe, in North America, Australia, for 2 or even 3 generations. Many of us may no longer have close relatives or large properties back in South Asia, which means that people can speak frankly where they are about wrongs taking place in their country of origin. So why don't we kind of reflect on this possibility? If a dozen South Asians from half a dozen South Asian lands get together often enough, they may eventually get transformed into some kind of a model, some kind of a prototype of mutual understanding. The people will start, and the leaders may follow. This could well turn out to be kind of a real strategy. So I would conclude by saying that we should give this formula of by the people, give this formula a chance. It could help in facing the assaults today on democracy, on equality, and on mutual goodwill. So thank you, Faisal.
Thank you very much, Rajmohanji. All of you have kind of pointed out this theme of mutual goodwill, as Rajmohanji just put it. And I want to touch upon that in two different scales. The first one is a more individual, personal level. Each of you have been a part of your own respective movements, have been a part of this, collective struggle in your respective countries for a long time. Before we get to kind of the regional sense of this, I'm curious how each of you have, I guess, experienced or confronted this idea of like a politics of persuasion when it comes to organizing, when it comes to mobilizing people for a specific cause. I find as an organizer, whatever I'm a part of, wherever I am, I often find this to be the most anxiety-inducing thing in which, I talk to people who disagree with me vehemently on everything from who should be elected to certain politics to what they even believe in when it comes to human rights. And I've always sought to, approach it very diplomatically, try to state my value. And for me, I often find I have more conviction when I try to hear the other person's side, when I try to build up their own arguments. But at the end of the day, it's not as scalable. It may not be as sustainable. So I'm curious about your perspectives on how you approach people, how you've seen those kind of, again, mutual goodwill when it comes to organizing for a movement. Wima, perhaps we can start with you this time.
Actually, one key lesson I learned from the recent experience of the Aragalaya or the people's struggle, it was actually a very organic mass movement, I would say, because people were struggling and they all felt the need to come together. So there were a lot of diverse groups coming together. And I experienced it staying in the Gold Face for days. And I saw like different political groups, activist group, and people who are concerned about the goodwill of the people. They gathered and stayed there. And there were all different groups, but had one clear cause that they were fighting for, and the slogan of "Gota Go Home." And I feel even the smallest amount of contribution matters. And I met people who just bring meals to the protest ground and come to the protest ground after their work and come and share their struggles, and being there, listening to those voices, and make them feel that they're also being part of this mass movement at a level that that they can be part of. And we had groups coming from all different parts of Sri Lanka coming and sharing their long-lasting struggles of disappeared people and the injustices they face in their respective areas. And I feel at one point, even accompanying them, building those trust among the groups, that's very important when we are leading a social movement. And I feel one of the struggles that even the Aragalaya had was, it was known for a political movement, and there was not one group that was identified as this is the group that leading the Aragalaya. And that has its own pros and cons to it. But even then, being there, accompanying each other, building the trust among different groups, I think that's more important. I will add more about the, how this led to a lasting kind of a change later, but most importantly, those accompanying the voices is very important building trust.
Linji, maybe you can elaborate on this, what are other mechanisms for building trust, maybe within the context of Bangladesh, but also as we start to get more into a regional mindset here, even across borders?
I want to bring a slightly different perspective over here. In terms of the upheaval that took place in Bangladesh, it originally began as a very simple demand that the students had, saying that you cannot reserve so many of the prized jobs for people who are under your control. If the government had initially just given way on that, in fact, they subsequently gave way totally, we do not see how the movement would have gathered any steam. So let me throw the question back and say that something happens in the minds of those who are in control. It gives them an arrogance, which then leads to a hubris. And perhaps others can pick up on this point. And well, let me just leave it there.
It's a really interesting point. Something just I'm thinking of as you said that is how much do the people reflect the mindset of their leaders versus shape them? Just something that maybe we can discuss as we continue. But Faria, I'm curious about your take here about mechanisms of building trust, about how trust dissolves between maybe an oppressive force and the people, and what that means for movements.
Actually, what Salimji said is important. This is something that I think we see. So state high-handedness creates certain outcomes, which then I feel, and what I've seen over a period of time, leads to people collectivizing on an issue they're creating, but the goodwill is also the organic connections that are forged. When you show up, if somebody is disappeared and someone's protesting, or for them in court, for instance, right? And this is again across ethnic and class divisions, etc. And we've seen that coalescing happening, where these grassroots movements, etc., and people are able to see and connect with them. And especially, and I've seen this in my circle where journalists get persecuted for saying something, and then the discourse around it. And again, not to be sadistic or the whole dark humor thing, but sometimes even in our sort of friend circle, we have this united by trauma or dysfunction, because somebody or the other has either gone through it, or you've been there for someone at a time of need. And that's something that people really connect with. And this is something I've seen and also now. So just yesterday, for example, there were a lot of Pashtuns who were being discriminated against after what happened in the capital, and also this conflation with them being Afghan. And there's this, there's been deportation and all these kinds of things. And so along ethnic divisions, but then there are people from the city who don't belong to the same ethnicity or nationality, but they are there to support them. And so when these things start happening, or for example, if there are daily wage earners and you're there for them, irrespective if you've got nothing to gain from it, or for when there was a crackdown on the Pashtun Tahafuz movement, when they held their jalsas in 2018, and there were Sindhi lawyers who were also defending them. So to see those connections where there usually is a lot of hate, this connects people. And even regionally, every time we get together in a room or we speak to each other, there are so many connections. There's so much shared, there's shared thing, history also, but there are a lot of things that we can relate to immediately without having to provide context to one another in terms of what is happening politically or socially or otherwise. And I think the more we're able to do that, because the state thrives on dividing and keeping people apart. And the more opportunity there is, and sometimes that opportunity presents itself through the hubris and arrogance measures taken by the state, where organically people circumvent those barriers and do get together to be there for each other.
Thank you, Faria. That was really well said. again, before I get to this big question on regional identity, Dovan, I want to ask you, as someone who has, focused on design, who's been a part of a lot of these movements, how do you convey this type of empathy that Salimji and Fari are talking about? How do you show people to move beyond, is this true? Yes or no? Are we on this side of the political aisle? Yes or no? Like, but instead looking at what people are going through and collectivizing on that.
Yeah, so here I also have to do some I had to do some self-reflection myself because when I was young, when I was taking part in the movement in my younger years, I could be one of those people who are kind of doing this us versus, that vilifying thing. Oh, these people, these Pahari people from the hills, they do not, empathize with the issues of the southern people. They are all racist people. I was playing that game. But then recently, I was part of the one of the mobilization in the mobilizing group, the citizen movement, and I think like because after this post 2015, things have changed a lot. There's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of paranoia, and there's a lot of like very infighting, especially among the progressives. And I had to go through this long self-reflection. And what I found for my own realization, what I felt is that I think if we just engage people on the cognitive level, I think we have hit a wall, right? I mean, people, we all know the literature, we know the facts, like if we just try to, win over on the cognitive level. So for me, I have kind of gone to the direction more on the, I don't know how to like phrase it well, like more on the psycho-spiritual dimension as well, reaching out to people's emotions, their fears, their aspirations, and also reaching out to their sensibilities, their aesthetics, right? So I think the work we have to do is like how do we cultivate that aesthetics, that sensibility, because with just cognitive logic, if you just go to the historical fact, it just depends like how far you go, right? Which facts you choose. We're always cherry
Mm,
picking. There's no. So for me, it's like I mean, we are connected not by facts, maybe, but by our sensibilities, our aesthetics.
mm.
So aesthetics of humanity and peace and love. How do we do that? And again, Rajmohan Gandhi is here. So for me, I've been going to the Gandhian thing. So my own hypothesis is that like what Gandhi did is like brought that spiritual dimension to the political movement. But I think his limitation was that there's, I think, lack of more holistic notion of spirituality, and also the maybe the psychology as a domain had not been mature so much. So maybe more like self-awareness. So if we can bring this together, I mean, for me, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm done with this like a cognitive discourse at this point.
Thank you, Dovan. There's so much here to unpack, and the way I want to take it is, of course, I'm going to go to Rajmohanji here. Is you talk a lot about this selective discourse almost in trying to stir that empathy to try to build bridges. Something that I like to do. Some of you have been a part of these regional forums that I do, and I always start by asking everyone from every country, what do you think is the best biryani in the South Asian region? And I think I'm like this close to starting a war when I ask that question. But it really helps. I mean, everyone starts laughing and joking around, and we start to realize that our cuisines are actually very similar. A lot of our holidays we share. That sense of spirituality that Dovan just brought up is also very similar. So, Rajmohanji, you brought this up in your last answer, and I'm curious how you want to take this because how else can we shape and frame a regional identity in order to strengthen each of our individual efforts for peace and justice and human rights? And how do we create lasting change through that framing?
So I try and give two responses. First of all, I want us to be reminded of what Professor Salim Rashid said just now. The mistakes that people who have power make. As he said, if the power a few months ago in Bangladesh had responded in the right way, but they were arrogant and they did not. And so the movement really spread. So I think we who want to fight for democracy, for equality, should also recognize that now and again, and very often, people make blunders. So we should be ready for the moment when people in power make their blunders and make their mistakes. These things do happen. So this should. The second point I want to make is that we hear from different parts of South Asia meeting just now. I think it's been a very useful conversation. This should be repeated. But also, this is a crazy thought, and I may or may not work, but it's something like this. This group is from different parts of South Asia, because Asia is a much bigger deal. There's also the Middle East, but I'm thinking especially of Africa. Why shouldn't a group from South Asia meet with a group from, say, Nigeria or from Kenya, from some other part of Africa, so we can learn about some important parts of Africa, and they may learn about an important part of Asia. So I don't know how it can work, but it will be, to me, for instance, I often think about Nigeria, which has many similarities with South Asia. It has Muslims, it has non-Muslims, it has many ethnicities, it has huge population. It has very, very clever people. It has a lot of corruption. So I think a conversation between South Asians, say, and some Africans, maybe Nigerians and some others, if it can be mounted, that may be one step forward. That's it. That's all from my side.
Thank you so much, Rajmohanji. I completely agree with that. I think, there's often intergovernmental mechanisms for collaboration between countries like in Nigeria or Sri Lanka, and I've never understood why there needs to be a Western middleman. I think there's so much resonance to be had, as evidenced by everything that we've all said here. As I continue these questions, I also want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please add them in the chat now, and I'll read them aloud as we just have a few minutes left. But I want to take it over to Salimji here to maybe expand upon a bit of what Rajmohanji said about regional identities and how we can resonate with one another in terms of movements, human rights issues that are going on, and just general resonance.
I think the points raised by Raj, and excuse me for just addressing him directly.
Good.
I should say Raj Bhai, are important on two levels. One, it is absolutely true that what triggered the anger of the people at large, and especially the students, were some very emotive declarations made by the government through their arrogance. Let me not go into the particulars here, we don't have the time, but it was the emotions that stirred up people and said, we will die for this. It was not, I think, the point made earlier by Dovan was very correct. It is not a cognitive change. It was, at that point, it became an emotional change. And on the question of building up trust between communities, what has struck me that the more I have read about the history, the more it has been clear that the Hindus of today are not the Hindus of yesterday. They are actually quite different people in terms of what they believe and how they interact with each other. So frequently in history, we find Muslim kings having Hindu generals and Hindu soldiers, and vice versa, Hindu kings having Muslim generals and Muslim soldiers. We find many doctors tending to the leaders of an opposing faith. This level of interracial, interreligious trust that existed, or what I would call at a human level, the last 50 years have made this disappear. And we need to understand why this has happened, how it has happened, and to ask people to simply look back at what their grandfathers did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salimji. I'm going to start integrating the questions from the chat as I start winding down here. I want to take it to you real quick though, because two kind of small questions, not really small, but the first one, you mentioned something about how lasting change can happen that you wanted to elaborate upon. So I want to give you a chance to do that. But I also wanted to point something out. I think, me, you, Salimji, Rajmohanji, we're all not in South Asia where we're normally based. Correct me if I'm wrong. Um, and I'm very curious about how you manage conversations, still work in advocacy in that region from a distance. What groups do you still connect with? How do you maintain that balance? Over to you.
Talking about the lasting change after a movement, and I think many of you are familiar with the recent political transition in Sri Lanka. So soon after the Aragalaya struggle in 2022, country was kind of led into an instability. People were blaming protesters for the even the president we had, but without a mandate. But I feel people eventually voted for a party which promoted ethical practices and changing of a political culture because of the Aragalaya laid the groundwork for that change to happen, and people felt the need to vote and understanding the power of vote that they had. If they want to see a change in the political sphere, that they can do it with voting for this particular party. And I think even for the temporary movement to lead a lasting change, it requires a guidance and leadership that capable of carrying the weight of the people's demand. And I hope this new government be able to deliver those demands that people carry, all those hopes. But again, I would like to add that even though I'm away from my country for a temporary period, but being in touch with people who are actually still fighting in the front line for a social change. Even earlier, I mentioned accompanying people. It's really important in a time of crisis, and having that connection, a trust among each other, and listen, deeply listening to what they have to share. And I think that's very important. And again, for example, I feel like the intellectual contribution, even Dr. Salim mentioned that, that's needed when young leaders are leading the change. They also need mentors, and that accompanying the change makers is important wherever we are. I think that's something I would like to. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, to build off of that, there was a question in the chat earlier about what forums or mechanisms exist for civil society groups and movements and individuals to engage directly with the South Asian region on issues related to human rights. Instead of vocally saying this, if the panelists get a chance, please do add in the chat so people can visit these links and check them out as we continue this discussion. Faria, I want to take this next question over to you. This is from the chat. Sorry, 1 second. Sadly, corruption is a feature in nearly all countries, although to varying extents. What is the solution, and how would the world change without corruption?
Corruption is something that was politically being agitated, and we've seen the fallouts of corruption. Also, corruption has many faces, right? And what we've also seen is that over a period of time, the entrenchment of the state in taking away the people's resources through various instruments, whether you put legal language around it and you craft these agreements and contracts. And what we're also seeing is, in Pakistan, a lot of people are also talking about a colonization of sorts of the contracts that the state may be signing, and we don't know what those agreements are, and we don't know how, if Pakistan as a state does not meet some of these agreements, what's actually going to end up happening, or the resources in Balochistan that are being taken away. So the people don't have agency or autonomy over the resources of their land. And I think that also harks back to, I think, what Dovan was saying, not a cognitive but a spiritual connection with the land, and what the land means to the people and what it should give to them. And there's always been a connection, I think, and the word used dharti across the South Asian region, of what it means. And we're losing those connections. I also want to tie the corruption question to what Raj Mohan ji said about beyond South Asia. So he mentioned Nigeria, and every time I speak to a colleague in Nigeria, it would seem as if he's talking about what's happening in Pakistan with respect to the corruption, with respect to how the bureaucracy and the political government behaves. And he'd use this phrase called bread, broadband, and blah, blah, blah. And what happens is that these states keep you at such a nascent stage of things where everything, and especially in the digital rights sector, beyond connectivity, basic connectivity, all other discourse when we're at these conferences, AI and other kinds of things, fall in the blah, blah, blah category, unfortunately, because you're not letting anybody progress beyond, do we have internet connectivity today? Are we going to have it tomorrow? Can we? So the basics, we're not able to move beyond the basics. And the reason is, it's not just a financial corruption, it is a moral bankruptcy as well that the rulers have. But the flip side of this is that corruption is also used as a narrative, as we've seen in Pakistan from time and time again, for the military establishment, who first brings governments and then ousts them on the charges that they've been financially corrupt. And we're seeing this right now with Imran Khan. We've seen this previously with Benazir Bhutto and a lot of others, and Nawaz Sharif. So it's a double-edged sword. And then there's a whole thing about the establishments and the corporations being established and what they take away from the people. So I don't know if there's a very clear answer that I can provide to it, but of course, when corruption has a direct linkage to the economic prosperity of people as well. But corruption, we need to view with a very wide lens of what that means, and not just in the financial realm.
Thank you, Faria. We just have a very few minutes left, and I want to end on a very simple question. So I'm going to hand it over to each one of you. Please keep it brief so we can end on time. And the question is very simply, what gives you hope? What is keeping you hopeful right now? Salimji, would you like to start with that one?
Thinking clearly, if you like. I have tried to spend my life trying to understand what creates economic development. And I'm convinced that Bangladesh is capable of 7% growth. And if this big push comes, a lot of problems will get solved. Let me stop here. I would rather hear from the others.
Govan?
So again, I think it is my maybe leap of faith or whatever, but because I mean, human beings, we have managed to make so many things very complex, right? But I think there is some like a basic essence that tie us together, like this how sunflower, it always, follows the sun, there's some kind of very basic sensibilities, that is common to us. And I think sometimes we forget like how to get to that, because of the complexity that we have created. So if we are able to, distill that, go to the basics. And also I think that human beings, we can, I mean, now we are in this very at a very epochal moment, right? That all the nation state are coming together in this very global thing, and I think a lot of crisis is coming from that disorientation. But I believe in our collective intelligence and our collective solution making that we'll find a way. And also the other thing is because if we don't find a way, we are in a way of like a existential crisis, do or die situation, right? And I don't know, maybe this is just I'm being delusional, but I just have this belief that I think it might take some time, but I think we'll be able to find our way finally.
All right. I'm still muted. Well, you figure that out. Wima, do you want to go next then? Well,
Okay, yeah. What I believe in is the collective leadership, leading with compassion, and I'm very hopeful for my country and the region that we will have serving leaders, and or individuals have their own responsibility. Each one of us have our own responsibility to contribute to that, and that's my wish.
thank you. Faria?
I think the people-to-people connections. I know that sometimes we get focused on outcomes only, but the processes that connect. And change is inevitable. And as the one said, time, we will see things change for the good, even if it goes through worse.
And Rajavanshi?
Well, I think that this conversation that we're just now having is one very solid contribution to hope. I feel that we from South Asia who live in the West, now in the Western world, which also has it has given great disappointments also. Nonetheless, in the so-called Western world, say in the US or Europe or Australia, countries like that, UK, people from South Asia and similarly people from other conflict regions can actually meet just as we are meeting just now. We can openly, the way we cannot do at the moment in South Asia itself. Have, say in the United States, people of South Asia meeting together, speaking frankly, finding that we have so many things in common, so many problems in common, and so many other things in common. Advantage of the opportunities we have of at least meeting, talking frankly, speaking frankly.
Thank you, Rajmohanji. That was beautiful, all of you. I guess I'll also just answer, I mean, the answer is pretty obvious. Hyderabadi biryani, of course. No, that's not actually the case. It's all of you, of course. I'm inspired by all of you, really. And I took a lot away from this conversation, and I hope the audience did as well. It was so lovely having this. We have to do this again. And yeah, I invite you all to stay connected, please. Like Rajmohanji said, we have to keep having these types of conversations. So thank you all for attending, by the people. And yeah, we had a great time.